Week 2, Unit 3. Exercise 1. On a large scale, weather plays a big role in the economic health of every nation on Earth. A timely soaking rain can rescue a crop from ruin, while a sudden cloudburst can wash it away. And farmers aren't the only ones at risk. Those who depend on natural gas for heat often watch in dismay as a particularly cold winter sends prices skyward. Hurricanes can drive tourists away from areas that depend on a regular influx of visitors for their livelihoods. Even a gentle phenomenon like fog can result in disaster, as the captains of the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm learned one fateful July night in 1956. And during the Dust Bowl of 1936, one of the hottest and driest summers ever recorded, more than 15,000 people died of malnutrition and dust-related diseases. Exercise 2. Defining a strict upper depth boundary for deep-sea fishes is problematic. Below 1,000 meters, the oceans are totally devoid of solar light. The temperature is generally less than 4 degrees Celsius, and there is no doubt that fishes living in these cold, dark conditions can be considered to be deep-sea species. However, between 200 and 1,000 meters, there is a transition zone where, although there may be sufficient light for vision using highly sensitive, specially adapted eyes, life is more or less unsustainable for normal surface-dwelling fishes. This zone contains some of the most interesting deep-sea fishes that are obviously different from shallow species. Despite living deep, many species have eggs that float to the surface so that larvae can develop in the plentiful food supply in the surface layers. In the open ocean, many deep-sea fishes migrate towards the surface at night and descend again at dawn to pass the day in darkness in the cold waters below. Thus, deep-sea fishes do not necessarily pass their entire life cycle in the deep sea, and adults may not be restricted entirely to depths greater than 200 meters. Exercise 3. There are no general strategies for conducting an argument because the specific something arguments are always about will always be embedded in a social or institutional setting in relation to which some but not all strategies will be relevant and at least potentially effective. In the political arena, one tried and true strategy is to damage the reputation of your opponent, accusing him or her of all manners of crimes, lies, betrayals, improprieties, and failures of judgment. But if you do that in an academic argument, an argument between two scholars about the interpretation of a poem or the correct account of a historical event, you might be rebuked and sent away because you will have disregarded the decorum of the academic game. The ways of argument are context-specific, and while there are surely some general things to be said about argument, and an entire intellectual tradition called rhetoric dedicated to saying them, in the end, the study of argument will be a study of the various contexts in which one encounters argument in its various forms. Exercise 4. Today, most of our planet's big animals live in industrial farms. We imagine that the Earth is populated by lions, elephants, and penguins, roaming freely across vast savannas and oceans. That may be true of the National Geographic Channel, Disney movies, and children's fairy tales, but it is no longer true of the real world outside the TV screen. The world contains 40,000 lions and 1 billion domesticated pigs, 500,000 elephants, and 1.5 billion domesticated cows, 50 million penguins, and 50 billion chickens. In 2009, a census counted 1.6 billion wild birds in Europe, including all species together. That same year, the European meat and egg industry raised close to 7 billion chickens. A large portion of vertebrate animals living on our planet are no longer free-living, but rather are owned and controlled by one animal, Homo sapiens. Exercise 5. Political acts vary in their capacity to convey information about what citizens want and need. The vote is a notably blunt instrument of communication. Although winning candidates often claim a mandate, in truth they usually have only an imprecise understanding of what was on the minds of the voters who placed them in office. In contrast, the many forms of direct expression of preferences, a sign at a demonstration, an email to a senator's office, a prepared statement at a meeting of the local zoning board, can communicate clear and, in some circumstances, quite specific messages. Organized interests are especially likely to communicate detailed information when they contact public officials, and this information frequently helps in the process of policy formation, although it presents a particular point of view. Exercise 6. During their second year, children learn to use the words old and young, which indicate that they have appropriated the age dimension. They can use this dimension to classify people. However, an understanding of an abstract time domain develops much later. Spatial metaphors for time are ubiquitous. It is difficult to talk about time without using words that originate from the visuospatial domain. Jean Piaget emphasizes that time and space form an inseparable whole in children's minds. In other words, young children cannot treat space and time as separate domains. This situation parallels the dimensions of height and volume, which are inseparable for preschool children, but become separable when children learn that volume is a conservative dimension. Similarly, space and time start as a single metric that becomes gradually differentiated into two separable domains. Exercise 7. No matter how hard you may try to produce an objective paper, the fact is that every choice you make as you write is influenced to some extent by your personal beliefs and opinions. What you tell your readers is truth, in other words, is influenced, sometimes without your knowledge, by a multitude of factors: your environment, upbringing, and education, your attitude toward your audience, your career goals, and your ambitions for the paper you are writing. The influence of such factors can be very subtle, and it is something you must work to identify in your own writing and in the writing of others in order not to mislead or to be misled. Remember that one of the reasons for writing is self-discovery. The writing you will do in the classes and for the rest of your life will give you a chance to discover and confront honestly your own views on your subjects. Responsible writers keep an eye on their own biases and are honest about them with their readers. Exercise 8. By creating artworks, artists offer views of the world and their unique responses to the world. The community, audience, group responds to the products of an artist's efforts by attempting to comprehend the uniqueness of the artist. The artist creates, the community responds, the artist makes again, the community attends, and so on. In a broad sense, art making may be considered to always be a group enterprise. Sean McNiff, an author and artist, said, "Life is always created from interplay among different participants who make contact, influence one another, exchange their essential natures, merge, and generate new forms. Creating art is a self-transcendent process. The vast majority of artists are very interested in the reactions their work inspires in others. This interest is motivated by the desire for human contact. A central healing quality of art therapy is the capacity to promote the development of relationships. Although some artists state that they must be left alone to do their work, still, most intend that someday others will acknowledge their creative work." Exercise 9. During its formative period, and because it was live, the essential nature of television was argued to be intimacy. The closeness of the image to the performance of the actors, unadorned and without the tinsel of cinema spectacle, could avoid the erection of a barrier between the screen and its audience. Television, unlike the theater, lacks a stage, orchestra pit, or footlights to separate the performer from the audience. Instead, television was to inherit its bedside manner from radio, to create the illusion of the proximity between the performance and listener-viewer. At the same time, it should be remembered that some television programs were and continue to be audience shows and are enjoyed by large masses of people gathered in some sort of auditorium or studio. Nevertheless, such big television variety shows, broadcast from a theater stage, continue to give the viewer at home a feeling of being in the front row, as well as among the other members of the audience sitting in the theater. Exercise 10. The best example I can share with you of not letting outside factors control you is to think of the late-night hotel front desk clerk. This person is responsible for receiving guests who may have encountered any number of difficulties in their travels to the hotel. The clerk doesn't know any of this, and he or she certainly doesn't have any control over them, yet the guest could still choose to treat the clerk with less than courteous behavior. The guest isn't necessarily doing it intentionally. It's merely the culmination of a difficult day. Same thing goes for the response you may get to your phone call or email. The prospect may simply be responding to you in a manner that reflects other things going on in their life at that moment. Don't let their actions impact your actions. You're better than that, and you probably have not had the same type of day they've had. Exercise 11. Many pleasures are not a response to need or deprivation. I can be perfectly comfortable, yet pleased by the warmth of the sun as it breaks the clouds and comes streaming through the bay window. A light snack does away with hunger pangs, yet I am still seduced by the smell of garlic gently sizzling in olive oil. These pleasures are the bonus of life because they transcend need. We experience them as pleasures, even though we aren't suffering from their deprivation. Thus, the enjoyment of food, when chosen rather than forced, turns eating into something more than acquiring nutrition. Pleasure rather than the satisfaction of needs is the point of the experience. Such freely chosen enjoyment presupposes an excess of time, attention, and usually some resources. It is a dimension of life that is not bound up with necessities, despite being part of everyday existence. It is a surplus, a form of grace, and thus has meaning that is not reducible to a function and serves no purpose other than the enjoyment. Exercise 12. In essence, when a retailer decides to build a larger store, it bets that it can use that extra square footage and expanded inventory to attract the higher volume of customers it needs to generate an acceptable return on investment. In contrast, as retail square footage decreases, so too does the number of products a retailer can carry. Moreover, smaller stores tend to have smaller trade areas and fewer customers. As a result, they have to ensure that the products they carry are well matched to the customers they attract. With limited space, it is difficult to simultaneously appeal to multiple market segments. Therefore, the location decision is especially important and requires the small retailer to emphasize geographic segmentation. That is, as stores get smaller, they generally need to be located closer to the customer segments they target. On the other hand, while larger format stores can carry a greater variety and broader selection of products that appeal to distinct customer segments, they have to attract enough customers from each segment to justify the added cost of that expanded space.